Good morning. Hello, Silke von der Bruck. How are you this morning?
Hi, Susannah. I'm good. How are you?
Good. I am well now that my children are recovered and back at school after the whole return to school excitement with the pandemic. and I know you as a mum, you also relate to that.
Yeah, we had 3 days of childcare until my youngest had to stay home again. So I feel you.
Mhm. Yeah, and actually, parenthood brought us together, didn't it, through
Yes, it
LinkedIn?
did.
That was a connection, but of course there was another key connection which we'll explore in this discussion. So
hmm
I'd love to kick us off and introduce Silke to our watchers. So I've got my little list here because my memory's not fantastic, so I'm going to return to my list. So Silke is an agile coach and a mother of 2 children who are aged 6 and 3. She's been working in Agile for over 10 years, has been a product owner for a long time, and now focuses her work on coaching, training, and workshops. And she's also, and this was the connection that really attracted me to
hmm
reach out to Silke through LinkedIn, she's also the founder of Agile Parenting. Right, so Silke's hypothesis is that in these times, in these days and times, it would be a great idea to introduce the concept of agile parenting in society. So, so in a moment, I think you'll discover why I was inclined to reach out to Silke about this.
Exactly. So I'd like to introduce you, Susannah. Um, Susannah is a mother of 3 kids. They're a bit older than mine. They're 15, 12, and 9 years old. And she's a certified Scrum Master and a team coach. And she's working during day, uh, supporting agile working mindsets and agile approaches at a major UK high street retailer. And by night, and this is really interesting, she's a gig musician, education consultant, music teacher, and a model. And she believes an agile mindset is the golden thread enabling her to deliver to a high quality in these varying roles. So you're a multi-talent, I learned.
Multitasker for sure. My life is multiple works in progress.
Yes.
So, I'll hasten to add, I know hardly anything about Kanban whatsoever. One of the things I love learning about day on day is, all of this knowledge and expertise that colleagues have got about different aspects of Agile, because I'm really new to Agile. I'd never heard of Agile till a couple of weeks ago. And before we get into it, Silke, I must apologise. Just for a few seconds, just as you were starting to introduce me, I accidentally blocked your face for a few seconds because I was going up to try and rename myself, because I realised that I'm on here as Susie Chambers, and this genuinely is not rehearsed, but I've just renamed myself as Susannah Chambers because one of the interesting things, I suppose, in terms of where I'm coming to this discussion with you from, is I have massive respect for anybody, but especially for parents that understand what it's like to wear those different hats, and
Mhm.
apply different principles that you live by in a particular context to another context. And one of the reasons I spotted just now about changing my name on the recording was because, about 10 years ago, I started using my full name in my day job and using my nickname in outside. And part of the reason
Okay.
for that was I really struggled conceptually earlier in my life to flick and context change between the different roles I'm in. So one of the things I'm fascinated to find out about from your perspective, Silke, is this thing around how learning about your children has increased your ability as an agile coach.
hmm That's something that really surprised me also, because when we had our first child, we just thought, okay, everybody has children. This has to be easy. People can do it. And then we learned, okay, it's not easy at all. It's the hardest thing we've ever done. And when in this area where we started learning about our child, understanding our child better, knowing how to deal with difficulties, I started learning about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned so much about how to get along with my child, and also learn really important things like being patient. Patience has been a thing I have learned so much with my kids, and forgiving, not being angry at them for not doing better. And those are also things that are really helpful when you try to be an agile coach, because you learn to be patient with the people you deal with. You try to understand why they're doing what they're doing, even if you think it's not the best thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a very important part of being an agile coach, not judging people for what they do, but trying to understand and trying to meet them where they are at the moment.
That's fascinating. That's such a crucial point. I mean, you're touching on a couple of really key transferable skills there, aren't you? You know, about, like you say, listening and understanding, tuning into what does that child need in that particular moment, which, as we know, in agile teams, and I'm, you know, by comparison with you, I'm a very inexperienced agile coach. But I have got a long pedigree of coaching experience in other contexts. And, you know, we all know, don't we, however experienced a coach you may be, it's that ability to really tune in to what that individual needs at that given moment. And I agree with you. I think with children, it's exactly the same. And I think, again, I think it's really important, isn't it, for people watching to kind of highlight, you know, I'm sure from your perspective as well, you know, when we think about agile parenting, it's not at all in a derogatory way in terms of, oh, you know, treat people like children. It's not like that. It's actually, if anything, I think it's about thinking about coming to agile coaching almost from a position of love, you know, and caring for wanting the best for people that we're coaching. And you also referred, oh no,
You're back.
we got cut off. So I wonder what's going to happen on the recording. This will be interesting. So it says it's still recording. So should we keep going?
Yeah, let's do this. But I couldn't hear the last 1 to 2 minutes you were talking.
Okay, that's fine. Well, we'll recap on that then. Silke, we're agile. We can do this, right?
Yeah.
So I was just reflecting back, you know, sort of, I think I saw you moving up to the point where I was saying that, you know, from a coaching perspective, you know, as opposed to just specifically agile, but with any coaching, about understanding what that individual is likely to need in that given moment in time. And I was just saying at the point where we got cut off that I think it's really important to people watching that they perhaps don't think that we're coming to this from a kind of derogatory sort of condescending point of view, you know, that it's not about treating people like children, is it? That's not the point we're trying to make, but more that it's kind of coming from a position of almost love and caring for the people and the teams that we're supporting, really wanting them to get the best. Does that resonate with you?
I would turn it around. I would say don't treat people like children, but treat children like people.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Can I steal that in my daily stand-up today?
Sure.
Sorry, not my daily stand-up, the team's daily stand-up. No, but you're so right. And and it's interesting as well, because where you know, you were obviously talking there not just about listening, but also about, you know, that non-violent communication style. You've just given me a flashback. I mean, one of my, you know, one of my failings as a mum in terms of not communicating as well as I wanted to with my children over the years. I remember, you know, probably about 13, 14 years ago when I first, you know, had very recently become a mum, and, you know, I felt like the worst mum in the world because I was taking my child to nursery and I just felt so guilty, and I was crying driving to work, you know, and obviously those days seem a long time ago now, you know, and all three of mine are absolutely fine from the sound, from how it seems at least. So I've kind of got over that guilt. But, you know, I do remember at that time there was something psychologically going on for me as a mum where, you know, I was feeling quite anxious about things, and it did end up being, you know, if you think from a sprint point of view, if you think of every day as a sprint, you know, and thinking like every morning there seemed to be that blocker, you know, getting to nursery, like, why can't you get your shoes on? I don't understand. Please, just get your shoes on. You know, so I remember standing on the stairs, and in the end, for me, the only way I ended up feeling like I could kind of cope with that blocker was shoes, shoes, shoes. And looking back on it, I'm horrified because that was so not like me. That was like very anti-agile in terms of, you know, parenting perspective. But I think it just shows, doesn't it, that however kind of supportive of an agile mindset you are as a parent as well, that, you know, you are gonna lapse into these things sometimes, you know, and it's completely natural.
Parenting is really hard, and dealing with that stress, with that anxiousness is really not easy, and it takes a lot of time and self-awareness. So you understand what's going on with you. Why does this stress you out so much? And I don't blame you. I think every parent has their weak moments. This is part of parenting.
Yeah.
And I think the important part in agile parenting is reflecting on your behavior. Mm-hmm. Seeing, okay, now I've treated my children the way I don't want to treat them. Mm-hmm. What can I do about it? How can I make things better in the future and not blame myself for the mistake I just made, mm-hmm. but try to look forward and see what I can do better next time.
That's such an important point you make about reflection, and you're right. I mean, in that context, I'll be really honest. I mean, it took me a lot of years, actually, I think, to actually move out of that. Mm-hmm. I was so kind of, you know, used to that kind of habit in the end. And, you know, eventually, obviously, you know, they could do their shoes and, you know, the behaviour stopped and there wasn't the need anymore. But I think it's interesting what you've said in terms of thinking about agile teams as well, because you're right, you know, that I think sometimes in teams as well, inevitably, you know, there are often those behaviours, aren't there? And like you said, the key is in the reflection, because inevitably if there are dysfunctions in a team, in the same way as you say about reflecting as a parent around that experience, you know, it is the same process, isn't it, pretty much as teams go through in a retro or you know, on an individual basis. Yep. So the other question I'd like to ask you is, we've talked there about you know, non-violent communication, listening, we've talked about reflecting to drive continuous improvement. One of the things I'm curious about is, you know, you've talked about the reflection there, but I want to perhaps explore your views from the other side in terms of yeah, you know, you can have the reflection, but what about if the person / the child or team colleague, what if they don't want to do something?
That's the really interesting question, because that is when you can show that you really mean being nonviolent. If they cooperate all the time, it's not really hard. If they cooperate, if they do what you want to do, then everything is fine and you don't have to deal with difficulties. And when people don't want to do what you want to do, that is when it gets interesting from a coaching perspective, because then with adults, you know, you can force them. Yes, you see the you would never think about picking up your colleague and bringing them to a different room to right? You wouldn't do that because they're adults. But we do this with children almost without thinking about it.
Mm.
And that is the point where I would try to find out, okay, what's the problem here? Why do you not want to cooperate right now? With my kids, it's mostly that they're hungry or tired.
Mm-hmm.
So my go-to thing to do would be, do you need something to eat? Get them an apple or something that will get their blood sugar on a good level again. And then they're often much more ready to cooperate again. With a colleague, I can go around and ask them, do you need something to eat? I would much more try to get them in a quiet moment. It depends if this happens in a meeting where many people are present, you probably won't get very far trying to push your idea further. I would try to catch this person in a personal conversation when we have time, when it's quiet, when they're not feeling that everybody's watching them, and then try to find out, okay, what was the problem? Did I touch a topic that is very sensitive to you? What is your why are you opposed to the ideas that we were talking about, and trying to find their motivation? Because I think people always have their reasons to be against something. And finding out those reasons is the key to finding a better solution that everybody will be happy with.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, you've really made me think as well about kind of the idea, you know, the motivation. I know from our discussions that, you know, you're a fan of Dan Pink's work around intrinsic motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious from what you've said, as you said, you know, if not just in terms of intrinsic motivation to maybe want something or to want to do something, but actually on its head, what you've just described there about, you know, if somebody always has a reason to not want to do something, you know, what is their intrinsic motivation for not wanting to do it?
Yes.
Yeah, because I think again, very often when people talk about motivation, you know, whether it's in teams or whether it's in you know, let's face it, it's actually quite rare, isn't it, from a parenting perspective, that you would talk about motivation in children in relation to anything other than schoolwork. And as you know, I mean, my background for nearly 20 years, you know, and I'm still a passionate advocate for that, is around what's called family learning. And, you know, obviously that interfaces a lot with parental engagement, and that, because that's intergenerational learning, you know, you're inevitably looking at issues around motivation for, you know, what would encourage that parent or carer to want to learn skills, you know, whether that's with their child or not, or to support their child, but also for that child, you know, what's the motivation? And one of the things I always found fascinating with that aspect of education was that you know, very often, you know, people assumed by offering those kind of courses that the motivation for a child of doing that would be because they didn't want to be the only child doing it, or, you know, they wanted to get out of lessons. And actually very often when you ask the children, you know, why do you like doing it, or why do you want to do that, you know, it was because things like, you know, I want one-to-one time with my dad because I any, you know, and you know, just like you said, you know, it's often, isn't it, just taking the time to ask, even, you know, ask, why is this important to you? But the interesting thing is with the age of your children, because you've obviously got younger children than I have, you know, with your 6 and 3. And, you know, my youngest is 9, you know, so those kind of memories are gradually starting to fade about the, you know, the negotiation, constant negotiation about everything. But, you know, how do you, with such young children, Silke, you know, what strategies do you use to kind of try and understand that intrinsic motivation that your children have got?
It's difficult in the beginning when they don't really talk yet, and mostly cry and scream.
Yeah.
But also there you can understand what they need. And at the beginning, it's they're hungry, they're cold, they want to cuddle, they need sleep. So it's really, it's just a handful of things that can happen. And so in the beginning, you just try, okay, what happens if I do this? And no, this didn't work, then it must be something else.
Mm.
And
So you iterate.
yes, exactly. Experiment, iterate, try the next thing. And you start to get to know your child.
And with you using the word experiment as well, I find that a really interesting one from an agile parenting perspective, and just thinking about the parallels with agile teams, because again, I mean, you'll know better than me, when you're working with any teams, but especially if you're working in an agile environment, where it's fast paced, you're innovating, you're responding to emerging needs and adapting and pivoting, that actually you can build those relationships with somebody in the same way as you build that understanding and rapport and intuition with your child. And of course you can do that very well with particular colleagues, but there are always going to be those colleagues where, for whatever reason, because of personality or what have you, it feels that bit harder to kind of get on the wavelength. So there's that bit, but also the bit around, well, on Tuesday you might have a strategy for how you're going to engage with and support with that individual, and it works great. Okay, and then on the Wednesday you feel like you're approaching it exactly the same way, but the
It
response
doesn't work at all.
is completely different. So what do you think causes that? I mean, thinking obviously initially from an agile parenting perspective, I mean, how is that even possible that the outcome can be so different?
Yeah, because it's people. They're not machines. So if one method works one day, exactly like it's with children, the thing that worked yesterday probably won't work tomorrow anymore. And people are the same. They don't want to be treated like if I do this, then this other thing will happen. They want to be treated like individuals.
Yeah.
And so I think people often feel when we're approaching them like, okay, I found this method how I can deal with this person and get them to do what I want. People have a feeling for that, and if they feel you are treating them like that to get an outcome, they will probably not want to be part of that. They want to be seen as who they are, and as that their views are important.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I can sort of say, oh, we forgot to mention where in the world we are. So I'm in the UK, and Silke is in Germany.
I'm in Germany.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, that's fantastic, isn't it? The fact we can record like this before we start our day's work from our homes, and do this across the countries, and that's brilliant. But what I was going to say is, because as you know, I mean, I've absolutely loved the time I've spent in Germany working, but I was going to say that I think with all of this stuff, and I'd be interested in your views, where you think about international composition of agile teams as well. Obviously day to day I work with a lot of colleagues from all over the world, and what kind of cultural impact, from an agile parenting perspective, perhaps plays out. Are there any kind of differences, would you say, kind of culturally, from a parenting perspective, you've observed?
It's very interesting to see that every cultural background has their own definitions of what is important about parenting. And it's often interesting to see that even cultures that share the same language, like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, still have such different views on certain topics, that parenting really is a bit different in every culture.
Mm.
But from an agile parenting perspective, I would always take a look at what is important to you as a parent, as an individual, with the cultural background that you bring to the table, and then work with what is there. So if it's really important to you that your child eats healthy food, then I would start from this point and see, okay, what is healthy food for you? What is really the core of this? Why is this important to you? What can you do to meet your child's needs? And also feel that you as a parent are caring well for your child. And that's where you can do this with pretty much any background.
Yeah, and I was fascinated because, as I say, because I loved living and working in Germany so much, you know, I've often thought as well about the differences culturally with my experiences of being in Slovakia, because, as I've said to you, you know, I've got dual British Slovak nationality, and you know, I don't think, you know, and you know, we're not going to get into that. This discussion is not about it, but inevitably, you know, across the world, you know, we've got a different historic backdrop, haven't we? We've got different political and socio-economic contexts, you know, and obviously the age I'm in my early 40s now, you know, I grew up spending a lot of time in the former communist Czechoslovakia. You know, and of course, the word we've not mentioned in this conversation, which I think is very interesting, and I suspect it's because we're both agile coaches, neither of us have used the word, I believe, control.
Yeah.
And I think when, you know, when you think about parenting, you know, I suspect that a lot of kind of parenting practices that, you know, one would observe, you know, as you've alluded to, are very much about that kind of command and control mentality, and shifting from that, as you say, to that one of empowerment for the child. So that's that aspect. But then also, you know, with our agile teams and agile practice as coaches, that thing around, it's that shift, isn't it, from command and control to self-managing teams. And
Yes.
I guess ultimately, like, as parents, presumably, I'm making a sweeping statement here, but presumably one of the things as parents that we want for our children is for them to become their own self-managing team. You know, not that they won't ask for help or what have you, but that they can navigate, you know, they feel confident that they can navigate life confidently with the resources that they've got. And the phrase that springs to mind, because of the connection with German, I recently gave a presentation on like a coding community event. And I found myself inadvertently referring to the word Kraftwerk. Yeah, and for those of you that don't speak German, and Silke will correct me if I'm wrong, but Kraftwerk was not only the name of a really famous band of the 1970s that I loved, my parents loved, but it actually means power station, and a lot of their videos were like robots, weren't they? And it was, you know, really catchy electronic, some of the earliest electronica music. And, you know, like you said, you know, this thing around complexity and humans, you know, that's the thing that I think we're constantly, as agile coaches as well as parents, battling against, aren't we? Like trying to make sense of things without creating this kind of Kraftwerk environment.
Exactly.
That was an analogy that sprang to mind for me. Right, well, Silke, I mean, unless you've got any questions for me, I mean, I think we've covered quite a lot there, haven't we?
We have.
Well, just to say, it was an absolute joy connecting with you through LinkedIn, you know, and thanks for, you know, being so great to chat with. And yeah, and I really hope that this is the start of a longer term dialogue, because I think we've got a lot in common about our passions around this stuff.
It was really fun to talk to you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Silke. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.